Namaste. Welcome everyone to our webinar on how Hindu Dharma is transforming the West. We have a wonderful panel for you today. And we know in a world that's deeply entrenched in a Eurocentric worldview, the thought that Hindu thought influenced the West seems a little chauvinistic, maybe a perspective that the West doesn't accept. But this latest book by Dr. Jay Bunsel and Sri Kalyan Vishwanathan shows that this is in fact true. And our eminent panelists today will make that point in depth. So with that, let me just introduce our moderator for today, Dr. Jay Bunsel. He's a retired scientist. He's done so much work across the world. He's with the US Department of Energy. He holds patents and he's presented extensively internationally. But he is right now the vice president of the World Hindu Council of America, Vishwa Hindu Parishad of America, and serves on the governing council. He's been driving the Hindu Desha initiative, and he is a pleasure to have on with us today. And Dr. Jay Bunsel is in New Jersey. Let me hand it over to him. Just first, let me give a shout out to you if you've put your name and location in the chat. Dhavalbhai from Fremont, glad to have you on. Shantaji from Montreal, amazing to see you. Divakarji from Richmond, Virginia. Vandanaji from Ohio. Binduji from MA, Massachusetts, glad to have you on. Namaste. Hariji is in India, Uttarakhand, great to have you on. So thank you for putting in the chat. Welcome everyone. And Dr. Jay Bunsel, let me hand it to you to get us started on this important webinar.
Thank you, Ankurji. Thank you for the intro and welcome to my eminent panelists. Namaste and welcome to today's webinar. The title of the webinar, as Ankurji already mentioned, how Hindu Dharma is transforming the West, may appear a little bit provocative to many of you. Frankly, in today's world where Hindus and Hindu Dharma are being attacked from so many different directions, any claim of Hindu Dharma having done something useful to the, to the Western culture, Western society may sound, wishful thinking, maybe an empty boast or even heresy. However, I'm reasonably sure that by the time we finish this webinar, you would have been convinced of the veracity of that claim. Why am I so sure? Well, for two reasons. Firstly, because I have been personally I personally spent last 3 years along with my co-author Kalyan Vishwanathan on researching this subject, and as Ankurji said, have written a book on the subject. The book is called Hinduism and America, How Hindu Dharma is Transforming the West. I will tell you a little bit more about this book in a minute. The second reason I'm confident is the wonderful gathering of guest speakers that we have on our panel today. They are some of the greatest minds of our times, and they have spent a good deal of their respective careers researching and writing on this subject. So at this point, it is my pleasant duty to introduce our guest speakers. Now, first of all, I'd like to welcome Padma Shri Professor Subhash Kakji. He really does not need a whole lot of introduction to this audience. However, since tradition demands that I properly introduce all my guests, I will briefly touch upon his vast background. He is a Regents Professor Emeritus at the Oklahoma State University at Stillwater. He has worked in computer science, artificial intelligence, quantum information, and history of science. He has translated several texts from Sanskrit to English. He has also written extensively on the social impact of artificial intelligence and on the newly emerging consciousness science. He is the author of more than 20 books. He currently serves on Indian Prime Minister's Science, Technology, Innovation Advisory Council. And I will also add that he is listed as one of the world's most influential computer scientists of all times in the MIT Pantheon project. Welcome, Swasti. I would now like to introduce Shri Phil Goldberg. Phil has been studying India's spiritual traditions for more than 50 years, not only as a practitioner, but also as a teacher and a writer. His numerous books include the award-winning American Veda and The Life of Yogananda. Phil is a meditation teacher, interfaith minister, and a workshop leader, as well as the co-host of a popular podcast, Spirit Matters, and leads American Veda tours to India. Currently, he is also teaching a course at the Hindu University of America on the very subject of this webinar. Phil, very warm welcome to you.
Lovely to be here with you.
Thank you. And last but not least, I would like to introduce Shri Sankrant Sanuji. He is joining us from India. So Sankrant is an author, entrepreneur, a public intellectual, and the founder and CEO of the publishing house Garuda Prakasham. After working at Microsoft Corporation for several years, he left the IT career to focus on deepening his knowledge of the yoga traditions and to work towards a plural and sustainable world. He's an advocate for indigenous cultures and languages and has published a book titled The English Medium Myth: Dismantling Barriers to India's Growth. Sankrant is a graduate of IIT Kanpur and the University of Texas at Austin and holds 6 technology patents. He is also faculty member of the Art of Living Foundation. Sankrantji, very warm welcome to you. Now, a little bit about the book before I invite my panelists to speak on the subject of the webinar. So, the book project actually started in 2019 with a very simple idea. The idea was that the Hindu American community had just crossed the 50-year mark of being in this country. From a population of about 12,000 in the early 1960s, we had just crossed the 4 million mark. More importantly, the community had made major strides and significant contributions in every sphere of American life over such a short period of time. Now, this was unprecedented achievement for any immigrant community in the history of America. Now, this was a story that obviously needed to be told, if for no other reason than to leave a legacy for the coming generations. Since we have a long history of outsiders maliciously distorting our civilizational narrative, we felt that the recording of Hindu American history could not be left to others. It had to be done by us. So to that effect, we organized a major conference in Boston called Threads 2019 Conference. It was attended by almost 500 delegates from all over the US and Canada. And there were some more than 60 marquee speakers from a variety of fields. In fact, both Subhashji and Shri Philji were guest speakers at that conference. It was indeed a very successful event. Now, the idea of the book came immediately after the conference. The initial idea was simply to document the proceedings of the conference. However, as I began working on it, and for the moment I'm using singular because in the beginning it was an individual effort. Kalyanji came on board later, actually much later. So as I was beginning to work on it, I realized that I really could not talk about the accomplishments of Hindu Americans without talking about who they were, meaning what their cultural background was, what their heritage was, what their value system was, in short, what really shaped their worldview. So that part of the project got started and eventually got finished. And at that point, I realized that actually the history of Hindu thought in America goes much further back than the history of Hindu Americans. Whereas the history of Hindu Americans was only about 50 years old, actually the history of Hindu thought in America goes back almost 200 years to early 1800s, when an undergraduate student at Harvard was introduced to a translated copy of Bhagavad Gita and probably some other Hindu scriptures. The name of that young man was Ralph Waldo Emerson. The impression this encounter left on him in time became a major spiritual movement called the New England Transcendentalism. Now, that movement eventually included luminaries like Henry David Thoreau and Walt Whitman. The seed of Hindu thought that was planted in the American soil by this movement got a big boost in 1893 when Swami Vivekananda visited the United States, and was further nurtured by numerous spiritual leaders during the 20th century. Now, I began to realize that we would be terribly remiss if we did not cover that part of our history in the book. It is at this point that I invited my co-author, Kalyan Vishwanathan, to join the project. In fact, I must admit, I initially approached Phil to be my co-author. That was a bit cheeky on my part, but he said he was busy with another project and suggested that I talk to Kalyanji. The rest, as they say, is history. From this point on, the project became a joint project between my organization, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad of America, and Kalyanji's organization, the Hindu University of America. In fact, I believe this is the first book that Hindu University of America has published to date. Now, at this point, if you don't mind, I will share my screen just so you can see what the cover of the book looks like. Okay, so let me just recap what the book actually entails. And there are some really nice words from, in fact, three of the our guest speakers, as well as Shri Vedanandaji, who is very well known in the Hindu community. So I'm just going to recap very briefly what the book actually entails. It consists of three parts. Part one is, pertains to the cultural heritage of Hindu Americans. It covers a wide range of topics, including our core beliefs, our value system, a description of our ancient knowledge system, and our seminal contributions to the world, and so on. Part two provides an account of how various aspects of Hindu thought came to the West, especially to America, who the key influencers were, including many non-Hindus who were influenced by these thoughts and in turn became transmitters of our ancient knowledge in the West. Part three is the story of our immigration. This is really your story and my story and story of all the Hindu Americans in one way or another, and our integration into the mainstream America, followed by perspectives and stories of many Hindu Americans, like you and I, who have made their mark on this society. Now, if some of you are interested in buying this book, there is a tiny URL that I'm showing here, or you can actually scan the QR code that's in here, and I will eventually post the tiny URL in the chat room. But I'm going to very quickly, just transition out of this, and like I said, I'll post the QR code in the chat room. But I would now like to invite our first speaker, Shri Phil Goldberg. Now, Phil, you've been marinating in Hindu thought for more than 50 years. You've written books, you've taught courses, you do tours, and you shared some wonderful material with me on this subject. So I'd like to hear, I'd like our audience to hear from you as to why we believe the Hindu thought is actually transforming the West. So, floor is yours.
Thank you, Jai. I suppose I should apologize for saying no when you asked me to work with you on the book, but I did say yes to writing the foreword. So, and I was honored to do that. And I want to say a few words about the book, because I just took a fresh look at it, and I congratulate you on the finished product. When I wrote American Veda, I was already convinced that Hindu Dharma had established roots in America that were underappreciated, and that from the time that you mentioned earlier, the time of Emerson and the others, had found its way into the soil of America, into the soul of America, through many different streams, most of which were underappreciated and not even recognized. And so I wrote American Veda because I think this is one of the most important developments in American history, is certainly American religious and spiritual history. And there's evidence for that in every survey, every study of how Americans understand religion and practice their spiritual growth and development. This phenomenon that we're all familiar with, that we hear about all the time, of people, especially young people, leaving the religions they were raised in or that are part of their ancestral heritage, and becoming independent seekers, drawing spiritual wisdom from wherever they can get it. That would not be possible, certainly not in large numbers, if the teachings that came to us from India through literature and especially the series of swamis and gurus and yogacharyas who have come here, if that had not happened, and the Buddhist equivalents, you would not see the same evolution of American spirituality. I sometimes give talks on this subject, and to come up with a clever name, I call it a nation of yogis, because the spiritual trends are evocative or indicative of the pathways to spiritual illumination and self-realization that were defined and laid out by the rishis. And that define an experience-based spirituality and an individualized pathway to spiritual growth and development. This would not be possible, and I think it's one of the most important and positive developments in modern American history. And the book itself, when I published American Veda, which is now 12 and a half years ago, certain things were starting to happen that I alluded to, but didn't spend much time on. And those developments are captured in this new book. So I came to see it as a sort of update of American Veda in many ways, and a complementary volume that I'm happy to have, because I learned a lot reading it. And I should say in this context that one of the developments that is most important is what Dr. Bunce referred to, the coming to maturity of the Hindu American community now since the immigration laws were changed in 1965. the level of prominence attained by Hindu Americans, their mere presence, the presence of temples, which didn't exist when I first started to explore these teachings. All of this is now adding to the influences that I wrote about in American Veda in a very profound way. And I think it's a terrific and wonderful development, and it's a terrific and wonderful book. And I'm happy to be part of this. You're muted.
Sorry. Thank you. I was in the middle of answering a question. Okay. Thank you so much for those words, Phil. Now I would like to invite Sankranji. Sankran, can you turn your camera on, if you don't mind? And of course,
sure, absolutely.
So Sankranji and I go back a little ways. He actually is the he's the CEO of the company that Garuda Prakashan that published the book for us, and a wonderful job that they did. But of course, he's also a thought leader in the Indic thought space, and so. I'm sure you have your own views on how Hindu thought has been, transforming, changing the Western thought system. So I'd like you to say a little bit about that, also a little bit about just the, association with the book and, your publication process and so on and so forth.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jayji. And it's been quite a journey, actually, since we first got the manuscript and started talking with JG about the idea to what the book finally became. I know we had actually started off by almost doing as the conference proceedings of the conference that had happened. And the more we discussed, the more we saw there's an opportunity to make this much bigger and much more comprehensive. And so a lot of hard work was put in by Jayji. I mean, really, in a way, this has been his baby. He's been driving it right from the beginning, adding so much material, and really getting to a place where this book is a must-have for every Hindu American home, and not only for every Hindu American home. Whenever Hindu Americans are interacting in their workplace with their colleagues, when they're giving out take-home gifts, when they're meeting politicians, in all those cases, this book should absolutely be in a way an introduction to our community, an introduction to who they're talking with. And I think this is also very sorely needed. I remember being in Seattle one time attending a musical in the Intaman Theater in Seattle. And it was interesting. On the one hand, Hindu thought has so influenced America. On the other hand, there is actually less recognition of Hindus as a community. They were calling out, partly to acknowledge, and it was kind of like a funny thing also, like all of the different denominations and religions inside the audience, and they called out, all the Episcopalians like raised their hands and all this, and and they called out, Muslims and Buddhists, right? The only one that didn't call out actually was Hindus. It's almost like you can't use the word. And I found that was very strange that in a way it's like this strange dichotomy where on the one hand we have so much influence right from the so-called founding thought fathers of America. We should talk about Emerson, who's really, the poet laureate, if you would, of America, and the poet, rather the philosopher of America. You could easily call Emerson and Thoreau and all these people, all the transcendentalists. They had so much influence of Hindu thought on them, but the recognition of that and the awareness of that in the larger American public is still very sorely lacking. And this is also true despite the fact that there are, 30 million or more people doing yoga in America today. All of the yoga teachers go through teacher training where they're introduced to core Hindu texts, including the Yoga Sutras and the Bhagavad Gita. So this is part of core teacher training that so many of these yoga teachers go through. But still, despite all of that influence, all of that impact, uh, the notion when you talk to a American about Hinduism, there is still the stereotypes that come into mind about the caste curry thing, or some image of a fierce Kali, and so there are these very uh, hackneyed and old repeated stereotype typical images that they are carrying. So in that sense also, this book is a very, very important corrective. It's very important that this book be widely disseminated. It's a very important this book be widely read. And also so many Hindu Americans themselves, especially the second generation, and even the first generation, don't really know so many of the things that are in this book. So this book is going to be a learning adventure for all those who lay their hands on them. And it would be a wonderful book just to set out on the coffee table. So when friends are over, there's a discussion about it, whether the friends are, ethnic Indian friends, or whether they're American Hindus, or whether they're, other Americans or people who are living in America. Using this book as a seed for a discussion and for an introduction, I think is a great opportunity that we all have. So Jayji has already put out the QR code, and it's of course my duty as a publisher to pitch the marketing of the book as well. But really beyond all of that, it's really, this book is something I have it on my own desk at my workplace. I often talk to people who come visit me, and it really serves as this great introduction for both the Hindu tradition, taking so many aspects of it that are lesser known in Hindu contributions to science, to mathematics. Garuda also recently published a book on Hindu mathematics called The Imperishable Seed, How Hindu Mathematics Changed the World. And some of the core ideas of this, of course, are carried, because this is much more of an overview, a very comprehensive overview of so many aspects of it. So most people don't know, for instance, that they talk about zero perhaps coming from India, but they don't know that the decimal system comes from India. And without decimal system, there's really no modern mathematics. Imagine doing square roots and squares and all the mathematical operations using Roman numerals. Multiply 5,336, write it in Roman numerals and multiply it by itself, and you'll find it's barely possible to do that. So the decimal system introduced algorithmic way of calculating large numbers and dealing with large numbers, multiplication, addition. All of this comes from India. The trigonometry comes from India. We've traced it. Algebra comes from India. The fundamentals of calculus come from India. All this is not known. Similarly, in the fields of medicine, in the fields of so many different aspects that we don't, in metallurgy, in astronomy, in physics, in computer science, as Dr. Kark has written so extensively. So there are so many aspects and areas of modernity and of American life that have been impacted by our traditions. And most of, as I said, hardly the first generation and definitely the second generation are completely ignorant of this. And therefore, when our children go to college, they're also having to deal with and face with the stereotypes, and oftentimes they have no response. Other students and people from other religions, they're actually trained in this. They're trained on how to speak about their religion. They're trained how to respond to attacks on them, on criticism on them. And we don't have that. We don't have polemics. We don't have apologetics. We don't have all those things that would happen in a church or in a mosque and all those things. So, given all of that, I think the importance of this book is multifold. As I said, is serving as an introduction to others who are not familiar with that tradition, serving as a knowledge resource for ourselves, when to delve into and know so much more, and also being a way that we can respond to both criticism as well as do an advocacy for Hindu issues in the world as well. So I don't want to take a lot of time. Perhaps we can come back with the Q&A and talk more about that.
Sure. Sankranji, thank you for that. Actually, before I let you go and invite Subhashji, uh, there is a, many have asked a question if and when we might have an electronic version of the book. So if you could just briefly comment on that before I invite Subhashji.
Sure. I think we've had a little bit of a challenge with the electronic version, and the reason is that this is actually a coffee table book. It is absolutely gorgeous to hold in your hand, and all of the text and the illustrations, everything are coordinated on each page. So I've been actually having a discussion with the team to put this out on the electronic version, and we will be doing that. But just know that you will miss a lot of it if you don't have the hard copy. So I would expect in the next 2-3 weeks we will have this out there on Kindle. But as I said, because of the fact that the text and the images have to flow together, the Kindle version will more or less appear like a PDF, because you can't really paginate through Amazon the way that this book is supposed to be laid out. It's a very designed book. It's a designer book. And so I would really urge people to use this opportunity to actually get a physical copy, even though Kindle seems very easy to carry around. But the book is not simply an information book. The book is a piece of art, and it's a piece where you want to hold it, you want to put it on your table. It has a gorgeousness to it that you're not going to get in the electronic version.
Thank you, Sankranji. So Subhashji, namaste and welcome one more time. Before I, pose the question to you, I just want to say that I had the wonderful pleasure of having Subhashji at our home, and spent a wonderful evening chatting with him on all sorts of subjects. I mean, apart from being, the great author and professor, and he's just a great teacher of Hindu civilization. In just one evening, I just learned tremendously, and I will continue to cherish that forever. Subhashji, thank you once again for that wonderful opportunity. So let me come back to the topic at hand. So Hindu Dharma is not a proselytizing, belief system. We do not go around, beating people up and saying, if you don't do this, if you don't do that, then, bad things will happen to you. You'll burn in hell for whatever, and so on and so forth. And yet Hindu thought has spread in the West on its own, without without really any kind of a schema, if you like. So what do you think? That's part one of my question. There is a part two, but what do you think is the draw of Hindu thought system that appeals to so many people, who are not born into the faith, into this belief system? So that's part one of the question. I really like your analytical view on that. And I think along with that, the world is changing every day. I don't know what future holds, and I like you to do the heavy lifting of looking into the crystal ball and, share your thoughts on what the world is evolving to, and where Hindu thought might stand in the world that will evolve. So with that, floor is yours.
Thank you, Jayji. Delighted to be a part of this panel, and the book is truly beautiful. And I do urge everybody who's watching to get a copy, because as was pointed out by Sankran ji and Phil ji, it has a feel to it that you would love to, cherish and enjoy all the time. Now, to the two questions that have been asked of me. First is, what is it about the Hindu tradition which makes it so compelling? I'm assuming that you will agree that it is compelling because it is spreading everywhere. You go to any corner of the world, even small towns in Peru, for example, and you'll see yoga studios. And yoga is lived Hinduism. If you go back to the Vedas, there are 6 darshanas or ways of looking at reality, and 5 of them are analytical, and 1 is synthetic. And the synthetic one related to how life ought to be lived is yoga. So yoga is the heart of Hinduism. And since it's a universal way, it's for everybody, it's for everybody's enlightenment or everybody finding out the meaning to their lives. So open-minded people, no matter where, want to join this train, so to speak, and know their life because they're not being, it's empirical, they're not being forced into any belief system or any story, because we do understand that almost everything in life is about stories. Even science or various subjects of humanities are storylines which people adopt. And even old-time religions are also storylines. And sometimes even if the storylines are very improbable, because people want to hold on to something, they would. And that's how you can look at the history of religions over the past several thousand years. But Hinduism is a storyline which is open to you for empirical verification in your own heart. So this is something, this is like, in the Middle Ages, people were trying to convert lead into gold. So this is that gold, because this is the truth, which is accessible to everybody. So it is universal. And we live in the age of science where people are trying to reach out to knowledge that is going to be lasting. And now the influence of this can be already seen all across Europe. You find that in countries like Czechoslovakia or Czechia now, about 80% of the people say that they don't belong to any traditional religion. Even the latest census in UK, 37 or 39% said they are totally open. And often to say that they are open is a code word for saying that they are connected to yoga or to the universal way of looking at things. Now, Sankran ji made a very interesting point about how is it that as Hindu thoughts are being assimilated or being accepted by people all around, why is it that often there is a reluctance to stand up and say that we are Hindu, or even for Hindus born in the tradition, often not to acknowledge as to that this is what they are connected to. And I think that is a very interesting background to it that goes back to the whole Western attempt to peg Hinduism through the colonial lens, where in order to justify the 19th century colonial rule of India, they had to say that India didn't have any sciences. India probably had some religiosity and maybe some music and maybe these asanas, etc. But they have done such a great job at through their books and the education system, which sadly India adopted after 1947, which has poisoned the minds of people who have come through the education system in India against this tradition. So what often has to happen is that people must question what they've been taught and get reconnected to it. But that is happening, and we are having a kind of a renaissance in India, and certainly this book is a part of that. And not only in India, if you go to even countries like Saudi Arabia or Iran, and certainly Europe and elsewhere, you find that people do want to connect to yoga. In Saudi Arabia, yoga has even been introduced as a compulsory subject in schools and colleges. So it's sort of irresistible. Yoga, which is really the heart of Hinduism, is irresistible because it's the story of one's self-knowledge. Now, what about the future? That was the second question that Jayaji asked me. We live in the AI age, and one can very easily see as many people have, that we are on an inflection point. The world will change in fundamental ways. Firstly, more and more jobs will be gone. Jobs which require brawn, where robots will replace them, and jobs where judgment is required or decision making is required, computers will replace them, and that's already happening. With this, and since the average person knows that this is what's going to be happening in the world, we will enter into a new phase where there'll be fewer and fewer babies. Already happening in countries like in South Korea. The fertility rate in South Korea has dropped to 0.71 when 2.1 is required for replacement. So the populations will collapse. There will be huge social disruptions, and then people will turn to questions of meaning. And in fact, one can make the argument that if there is so much of unhappiness and depression, let's say in the richest country in the world, the United States, where 50–60% of the people are on psychiatric drugs, even 25% of kids are on psychiatric drugs. So why are they on psychiatric drugs? Because they're unhappy. And in spite of all the wealth that people have, they are getting hooked to drugs, fentanyl and so on. And just last year, 120,000 young Americans died of drug overdose, and same 2 years prior. And therefore, there is this great thirst for connecting to the truth. And now what the Veda is all about, and the whole Hindu tradition is all about the truth, and therefore it's not sectarian at all. Now, the enemies of this tradition would call it sectarian, or are speaking about caste and so on, but that's certainly actually false. And we don't have time to go into it. The caste system, as we know, was created by the British. The British census people acknowledge it themselves, and it's very well known to scholars, but somehow, due to historical reasons, people sort of embraced it. So I see the future as one where the way of Veda and yoga, because yoga is lived Veda, would be something that everybody would want to join up with, and not because it is Indian, because it is universal, it is the truth. It touches upon the central question that we have in science also, which is, what is consciousness? Modern science has reached to that door, and they don't know how to answer it, whether you look at it from the perspective of psychology or computer science, or even from physics, because you can't explain all the strange phenomena in cosmology, like the universe expansion is accelerating and so on. And it does appear that the answer to that would be from understanding consciousness in a manner which is a big departure from how it's been looked at in Western science, where consciousness is viewed as something that emerges out of the interconnections in the brain, out of complexity. But that certainly doesn't hold up to scientific scrutiny, and people are wanting to go back. And that is really what the Veda is. The Veda is Atma Vidya. Atma Vidya means it's the science of consciousness. And certainly yoga, with all the different ways which are described in the Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, and the greatest book of yoga, the Bhagavad Gita, whether you want to do it through karma, through actions, or through knowledge, or through bhakti or devotion. So I think all of these things are very attractive, that there is a multiplicity of ways that people can use for self-knowledge. And what is in somebody's heart does not really matter. Unlike Western religions, for the past 2,000 years, they have insisted on believe in this or that. That's not what the Hindu way is. The Hindu way is, well, be a good person. It's your character that matters. And we do know that as your mind grows, your belief system itself would change. I think that's very beautiful. It is it is, it's logical, it makes sense, it all hangs together. So how can it be resisted? I'm very, very positive about it. But of course, there would be challenges. There's social disruptions, and there's also a certain degree of envy and jealousy because Hindus have done so well overseas in every country. But if they are done well, that's not because they are using their wealth to grab onto power. It's the board of independent companies in the West, in America, who are picking good people who happen to be Hindus to head their boards, because our tradition teaches us to be broad-minded, to look at the goodness of everybody and to embrace everybody. In fact, when people go to temples, this is one of the Sanskrit sayings they repeat: let happiness come to everybody, let everybody prosper. So I think it's that attitude that in spite of the tragic history of education of the last 75 years since independence, where, as I mentioned, the minds of young people have been poisoned against Hinduism, because textbooks in India, they speak of all kinds of bad history of Indian society, but they present Western religions in a beautiful, positive manner, so that young people who grow up are quite confused. But in spite of that, what has protected Hinduism in India is what young kids, boys and girls, have learned from their grandmothers and from their aunts and so on, who held on to those values. And now, of course, things are changing, and the renaissance and the churning that is going on in India, and the renaissance that is taking place with respect to Hinduism and creation of new institutions like HUA, Hindu University of America, is also a part of that. And VHPA is doing great work. And certainly this book, I am hoping, will be bought by people, and they can be proud to show it to people, and perhaps gift it to their friends, American friends and friends elsewhere. So I'm really happy to have been a part of this panel, and the best of luck to the book for it to become even more successful than what it already is. And thank you to Sankran for having published it.
Thank you, Subhashi. Thank you for that very hopeful message, actually, in spite of the fact that we are living in some very challenging times right now. But, it's good to have that hope that, we are, working for the good, and good will ultimately prevail over evil as a fundamental principle of Hindu Dharma. Before I'd like to actually invite Phil for some additional comments. But before I do that, I just want to say one thing. Don't buy the book for yourself. Buy it for your children. Because you see, our children know us as parents. We go to work, we do something, and we put bread on the table, and then we go on vacation and all that stuff, right? So they know us as parents, grandparents, and so on and so forth. But they actually do not. I don't believe they actually have a broad perspective of what the society, Hindu community at large, has been able to accomplish over such a short period of time. And that is really what the aim of this book was to begin with, to showcase, your story, my story, story of the community at large. And, a claim I like to make is, if, your child can spend 10 minutes, just opening the book and flipping through the pages, I bet he will have one or two questions for you that, he hadn't thought of before, and it'll start a conversation that would be useful to both sides. So with that, I have a question for Phil, and actually let me read just 2 or 3 lines from from the book, and it's on yoga. But it applies to a lot of other things as well, that are part of Hindu thought. Now here we're talking about, even as yoga as a movement has been spreading its roots in America, yoga as a discipline has been slowly but systematically delinking from its spiritual roots. The concept envisioned in Bhagavad Gita and Patanjali's Yoga Sutra for spiritual enlightenment, that is the pursuit of dharma and moksha, has been adapted for its asanas or body postures and marketed primarily for its benefit in the realm of physical fitness, beauty, wellness, and so on and so forth. Now, I actually like to just quote give a quote from your own book, Phil, American Veda, and you made the point that America ended up putting the physical cart before the spiritual horse, or worse, ignore the horse completely. And that unfortunately is a phenomenon that is, occurring in many, many different fields. Meditation is one of them. The entire mind science has been taken over and, done some strange things too, and, being sold under so many different brands without giving credit to its originators. So, how do you see that? I mean, yes, yes, we're making a contribution, and yet people are just delinking it from its roots.
It's an important phenomenon and of great concern, but it's complicated. I want to add to what Subhashji said about why these teachings have attracted so many Westerners. I can talk to you, I can speak from my own experience and all my hundreds of interviews with Westerners and Americans especially who have adopted Hindu teachings into their lives to one degree or another. Americans are very pragmatic, and as for all the craziness that we witness every day and all the fundamentalism and well, you know what I mean. But in the end, if something works, if something's of value, we will embrace it. We will accept it. We will incorporate it into our lives. And that's what's happened over many decades with the teachings, especially of Vedanta and yoga. They work. They change people's lives. They hold up to evidence. They can be tested in the laboratory of our own consciousness and our own lives. And none of this would have happened if the teachers who came here had asked any of us to just believe what they tell us and convert and cast aside everything from our own past. It was presented to us as a science. These are precepts from Hindu tradition. Test them out in the field of your own reason and your own logic and your own experience. Look at the evidence. These teachings would not have caught on if scientists hadn't studied what the effects of practices like meditation and asana actually do in people's lives. And people found that they were of value, and so they accepted them to one degree or another. And like with everything else Americans do, we can then trivialize it and commercialize it and detach it from its higher values and its higher meaning. And that, unfortunately, is one of the side effects of what has happened to yoga. And I must tell you that I know a whole lot of Americans, Westerners, people who are not born into the Hindu tradition, who are just as concerned about this as you are. People who entered, who began their interest in yoga and Vedanta, and who had gurus and who traveled to India and spent time in ashrams and became teachers of one form of yoga or another, who recognize the higher value of yoga and the deeper meaning of yoga and the greater potential of yoga beyond physical fitness, and they bring that into their teaching. But there are always those who will trivialize and reduce something to its lowest common denominator, or try to make money out of it, excuse me, by distorting the higher value of the teachings. And to me, what really matters most is for all of us to take responsibility and protect the integrity of these teachings, and to recognize when it's being adapted in a creative and acceptable way to this culture and this time period. Just as every guru who ever came here, beginning with Swami Vivekananda and on through all the others who came here, they adapted the language, they taught to what Americans might accept and be interested in. There's a difference between that, between adapting something with integrity and holding on to its greater value, and distorting it and diluting it and corrupting it. And that's where the line has to be drawn, as far as I'm concerned. And I want to just assure everybody here, almost, most of whom are Hindu by birth, that you have a great many allies in this endeavor who are not Hindus by birth. And you have a lot of people who are Hindus by birth who will oppose you. So, where those of us who value the Dharma should recognize our friends and work together on this.
Thank you, Phil. My other two guests, if you have any comments to share on that particular issue, please, feel free to.
I would just like to add to what Phil said about how some people who are born into Hindu Dharma oppose it very stridently, and this is what's happening in India as well. If I go back to the whole question of why haven't the textbooks in India been changed in the last 75 years? Because there are Hindus and, of course, people of other belief systems and the left in India who are opposed to any shift away from the colonial view of India. They don't want Indian sciences to be a part of school curriculum, or yoga, or any of the universal wisdom that we have to be a part of all of this. So it's a big challenge in India itself. Now, to the other question related to why don't people in the US who do yoga, if yoga is really what Hinduism, lived Hinduism is, why don't they join Hinduism as a religious denomination? See, religion, as we see it, is also a social construct. You need so many other institutions which Hindus lack. Not only we have temples, but we lack many other things that temples traditionally used to do back in India. Temples back in India were also where schools were, where colleges were, like, churches all across the world. But when the British came, they cut that off. Hindu temples in India cannot do education. Other religions can do. So Hindu temples were taken over by the government. They've still not been freed. So we have brought that baggage here. And HUA is a departure from that, an attempt to, let's take ownership of what our tradition is. Because in the colonial period, the Western scholars said, we are going to tell you what Hinduism is. You are too emotional to speak up for yourself. And so they said, no, we're not going to listen to what you think Hinduism is. And of course, the Swamis, lonely Swamis, and of course, people like Vivekananda, and the books by themselves had a huge influence. You look at some of the greatest thinkers in Europe, all the way from Schopenhauer to, even Kant and Hume and everybody else. And in the US, Thoreau, Emerson, and many others, and the great writers. It's the books, their discovery of the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, even without the agency of somebody else telling them what it is, which has been world transforming.
Thank you, Subhashji. Sankranji, you want to share some views on this? We do have questions that Q&A box. Will get to them very shortly, but just a brief comment, if you.
Sure. One of the things I want to leave as a parting thought is that, you know, I teach the Art of Living program. I've taught it in the West, in the US. I've taught it in the prison system, and there is something that is very powerful about our tradition. So sometimes we get, you know, very defensive, or, you know, less hope because we see all these people and forces are attacking us. But it's good to remember that our dharma is truly Sanatan. It is part of the fabric of the universe. It is part of the fabric of consciousness. And it is here to stay now, and it will be here to stay for all times. That doesn't mean that we don't speak up for it, or we don't take, you know, I mean, Krishna is saying, yes, dharma atrophies, and he comes again and again to restore that. And so we have that part as well. We have that part to step up, to speak about it, to fight, and to show what is the right path. At the same time, we can do that with a lot of confidence, knowing that the entire cosmos is actually supporting us, because we are part of the cosmos, and in the entire consciousness wishes to evolve. With human beings wish for freedom, they wish for moksha, whether they can articulate it or not. This is part of the journey of every human being, and our tradition has the greatest resources to actually help human beings along this journey. And this is why over and over again, despite colonization, despite all of this, the shoots keep springing up, and more people get drawn to it. So yes, we have challenges, and this has always been true. Asuras were there all the time, you know. So demonic forces were there all the time. This is not something that new has happened. So this is part of the cycle. There will be forces who are dushkritams, who are evildoers, and there will be forces who will stand up for dharma, and that's our role.
Thank you. So, yeah, Sankranji, thank you for those wonderful words. There are a number of questions here in the Q&A box, and I'm going to take one or two from there. I'm mindful of the fact that we are at the top of the hour, and so we're kind of going into a bit of overtime, but I think we're okay. So one question I think is, Subhashji, really up your alley, and that is, how does AI align with Hindu Dharma, or is there no connection at all?
Yeah, very, very good question. And this is also central to what's going on in intellectual and policy circles across the world right now. In fact, a few years ago, DARPA had a big project, 20-30 scientists in the US. They brought them together, week-long workshops to ask if computers of the future will be conscious. Because if it were to happen that computers become conscious, clearly they will kill off humanity, because here we are these pesky little creatures, you know, never happy, miserable all the time. Computers become conscious, the world will change. And the conclusion then, of course, is that there are fundamental scientific reasons that computers will not become conscious. But this discussion of what is consciousness and what is that AI can do is very important for our times, because we cannot resist computers and AI. They will enter literally every field of human activity, and they'll also reveal to us that even if computers don't become conscious, humans will be very willing to cede control to computers. You know, just like what happened in the last 3 years, the COVID thing and the bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is also AI. Right? Every bureaucracy is some kind of AI, you know, follows certain prescriptions. So we ceded control, and there are some people even now who are walking around with masks on, because once they said, this is what the expert has told me, this is what I'm going to do, whether, I need to have a mask on if I'm walking by myself on the beach, right? So this has opened up this whole question of what are the limits to AI? What are the threats it poses for society? What does it do for us to ask of ourselves as to
Subhash, your voice just
am I also as an individual, am I just living by certain prescriptions in my causal mind? You have three levels of the mind. You have the normal mind, mana, buddhi, and ahankar. And what is the causal mind? And the causal mind is a kind of a dark space. You could call it the unconscious. If you are just living like that, then we are really not being ourselves, because we are not really communing with the Atman, which is beyond us, but also suffuses the very core of our being. So I think it's going to force people to ask these questions. And that's where Vedanta, which is the science, universal science of knowing who you are, will become more center stage. And once you know what Vedanta is, then the question of how do you use yoga to transform this causal mind so that you then are free? And that's what moksha is. I think all of those things are happening, and they're unstoppable, because this is the way unconscious is manifesting. Consciousness is manifesting itself through the human consciousness, and it'll also bring us to more compassion to animals, to all things around us. Right now, all these animal factories, they're horrors, and they've messed up the mind so much that yesterday I came across an essay which says that rising early morning is a sign of white privilege. There's some strange things happening on social media right now. So I think people will wake up, hopefully, and that's what they do need, a dose of Veda and Vedanta.
Thank you, Subhashji. It's always the darkest before the sun comes out. So maybe we're going through the darkest period, and to use your words, Captain Sanatan will all of a sudden appear on the scene and shine light on the universe and on all of us. So Kumuji has asked us to, to hold the book on the screen to see what it looks like. Rather than, I'm more than happy to do that for her on my screen. If yeah, so this is what it looks like. It's 8.5 by 11, opens horizontally. That is in a, I'm not able to really do good justice to it. It opens horizontally in a, what do you call what's that layout called? Um, but yeah, and this is what the back looks like. But really, I think you can't, as they say, you can't judge a book by its cover. You really have to, in fact, I like to just say, one more thing. There is something very common between an umbrella and a book, and that is they don't work unless you open them. Uh, so you really have to hold the book in your hand, open it, look at what it says, before you can really appreciate the what it's trying to do. So I think with that, I'm so Dhaval bhai, you've asked if you could be given the microphone to ask your question. I don't know if Ankurji is Ankurji, are you able to give Dhaval bhai microphone access for a minute?
Yep.
Yeah, Dhaval bhai, you're
Yeah,
on the.
can you hear me?
Yeah,
Hi.
yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, this is Dhaval from Fremont, California. Excellent session. Thank you, everyone. My question was about everything that was discussed. How does Sanatan and Sanatan Dharma relate to what was discussed so far?
Who
Thank
wants
you.
who wants to take it from our guest speakers? Sankranji, can I put you on the spotlight on this one?
Yeah, sure. I'm not even sure exactly what is meant by that question. Sanatan Dharma is generally.
I mean, just to be clarification, since you are not clear about the question, what I mean is we talk about Sanatan and Sanatan Dharma, that's more fundamental apparently than Hinduism. So I'm just wondering, how do you relate that to Hinduism? And since this book is on Hinduism, Hindus.
Sure. I would just call it a terminological thing at this point. Hinduism has been a term that obviously has some roots in the English language and so on and so forth as in the terming of an ism. And at some point, Hindus also decided to identify, there's some history to it, as themselves as belonging to Sanatan Dharma, and Sanatan Dharma basically saying that this is an eternal idea. But I don't think this is a very deep discussion. I think at this point it's just synonyms that can be used.
Yeah, okay. I'm actually going to, I think we should close this webinar in a minute or so, but there is one comment in the chat room that I think is something that gives us a true, heartache, and which is, how do we connect with our next generation? It's basically saying that Hindu youth are not seeing the value of Hindu Dharma and yoga. How are we going to deal with that? I mean, that is the $64,000 question, and we are the people who know how to make computers talk to each other. And it's actually amazing that we haven't learned how to talk to our next generation. I mean, this always amazes me. I meet a lot of youth who are actually very much, in the dharmic way. They are very curious about our traditions. They're very curious about our, about their heritage, and they want to learn more. And of course, there's the majority of them that, they're basically living their daily life, busy with their coursework and exams and so on and so forth, and the rest of it just goes to, goes in the wastebasket. But I think part of it is how we communicate with them. I come from the first generation of immigrants who, were obviously raised by, I was raised in India, and there's a certain way of talking to your children, certain way of addressing them, and I think we just kind of use the same verbiage, same terminology, and same way of, talking to our children, and that doesn't work in the, in the world that they're being brought up in. So I think this is not a one-person project, but I think as a community we have to figure out how are we going to, communicate with our children in a more meaningful and deeper way. And it may sound like a cop out, but that's the best answer I can give to that question.
I think, JJ, let me add just a little bit to that. The most important thing is for dharma to be relevant to people's lives, to the children's lives. The more they realize that this is not just some mumbo jumbo their dad is telling them to do or something like that. I've raised two children in the US. Literally is a resource for them, is an asset for them as they navigate their life, as they navigate relationships, as they navigate negativity in the world, as they navigate their career. That all of the resources of our tradition are huge assets to them for that work in the world. And also as they come to realize that in some senses all of it is Maya as well. Right. So all of that, as they go through the journey of life, the more as relevant to what their experience is, the better we will be able to make it part of their life.
Yeah, thank you, Sankranji. And I think I will just add my own personal experience. We have raised three children. They are adults now. They have their own families now. And they went through the typical teenage years where they don't want to talk to you, or they don't want to acknowledge that they come from a different, they want to blend in with the society, and that was the case with all our three children for sure. But when they grew up, they probably 25 or a little bit older, all of a sudden they had this intense curiosity to know about their heritage. And we are, my wife and I are extremely gratified that they are actually very much interested in our tradition. They bring their children to all the things that we celebrate at home, and they're also taking part. So, I just want to leave with that hopeful message that it is part of growing up. You go away, do your you be a rebel in those sort of growing up years, and then all of a sudden you become an adult and you want to know about who you are, where you came from, and what your traditions are. So I think with those words, I would like to thank our three wonderful guest speakers, Swasti, Sankranji, and Philji, for being part of this great dialogue. Hope our audience got a lot from this. I certainly did. And on that note, thank you, and thank you, Ankurji, for always being at the helm of this webinar and keeping us, straight and narrow. Thank you so much.
No, absolutely. My pleasure. Let me just launch a quick poll. Let us know if you would be interested in one of these courses. And as I do that, Anil G from San Jose, thank you for joining us. Nikhil G from Fremont, Ravi Huda from Toronto, Canada, Jaya from Coimbatore, Shivjindal Ji from Ottawa, Swami Chidananda Ji from Mumbai. Thank you everyone for joining us. Sri Kumar from West Palm, Florida. And again, I can't say it enough. Dr. Jay Bunce Ji, thank you for moderating in our wonderful panel. Thank you so much. Namaste, dhanyawad.
Namaste.